Hi, my name's Tori and I wish I knew more about blood products.
Hi, my name's Letitia. I wish I knew more about taking care of myself when starting shift work.
Hi, my name is Lydia. I wish I would know more about how to work as in a team and solve conflict.
Hello, welcome to Five Things, the nursing podcast from the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital. My name is Liz Crowe.
I'm Jesse Spur, and this is a podcast by, for, and with the amazing nurses and health professionals in our corner of the world. We hope to connect with a global community as we move from surviving to thriving. Welcome to Five Things.
Hello, my name is Liz Crowe.
And I'm Jesse Spur.
Welcome to another episode of Five Things. Today we're welcoming Jacob Haberley, who is an RN on Ward 9B South here at the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital, and he's come to talk to us all things falls. Hi, Jacob.
Hello, good to be here.
Really great to have you, mate. And you've just disclosed you're very early in your nursing career. A couple of our best episodes have been from new grad and very early career nurses. So I think it's great to have a boots on the ground approach to a topic that gets talked about a lot, but it'd be great to have your practical aspect of it. A couple of things though. We'd love to hear your nursing backstory. I mean, it's shorter than some of our other guests, but I'm sure it's quite interesting.
So I initially came into the field of nursing because I had a desire to go into postgraduate medicine.
Okay.
I found that I always picked up pretty well on the science aspects, but people skills were not something I was initially blessed with. And I figured, what better a line of work to absolutely beat people skills into my head?
I love that. Great insight.
It seems to have worked. I sat GAMSAT and then decided that, no, I'm fine with nursing. Nursing's good. So I completed my bachelor in late 2021, having avoided most of the hiccups of COVID.
Yes.
It took me a little bit to attain my graduate position, but at the end of 2022, I secured a graduate position in Ward 9B South, so General Medical, here at the Royal, and I've been working there since.
Yeah, what a great, I think this is great because we have had a lot of really experienced nurses and a couple of midwives on, and it's great to hear from the new grads because this is really where we were pitching the podcast when we first started it.
Yeah, and we've got to situate this in that you came heavily recommended by Margaret Cahill, who did one of our early episodes on delirium, and particularly in the context of the Eat, Walk, Engage program. And that's a little bit of a segue to why you're here, isn't it, in terms of your advocacy and engagement with Eat, Walk, Engage?
Yes, definitely. So Eat, Walk, Engage has a heavy presence in our ward. Our patient demographic is very heavily geriatric in nature, but we also have a significant number of patients present who have significant degrees of cognitive decline, physical frailty, and dementia is key there. And it's the risk of delirium on our ward is extremely high due to both serious illness and patient frailty. And the Eat, Walk, Engage program is a very effective means in reducing those risks both to patients and staff.
Yeah, beautiful. All right, so let's get straight into it. Help us understand falls. As Jessie said, this is something that we've had a lot of requests for. So your first one is, why do patients fall?
Yes, so we all have an understanding of the slip, trip and fall, which according to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, 32% of falls that take place out of the hospital setting are from tripping over an object on the ground, so carpet or similar. In hospital, we tend to have a little bit less of that issue due to primarily non-carpeted floors. Cables are still an issue, but the primary contributors to falls in the hospital setting, we have our particularly delirium and dementia and cognitive impairment. So a patient who may not have the full level of understanding in that moment of how best to move, how best to maneuver around obstacles. So the environmental issues are omnipresent. We don't have enough space in a hospital ward environment to do everything we would like to do with all the furniture and all the equipment we would like to have. And a a patient may, in a moment of rush to get to the toilet, for example, try to climb over the tray table that's sitting in front of them, either because a buzzer hasn't been put in reach or because nursing staff are not able to attend to them rapidly enough when the buzzer is pressed. We also have issues of incontinence in particular, where a patient, due to the significant level of shame that is experienced in an incontinence episode, a patient may have gone 60, 70 years with a deeply seated understanding and control of bladder and bowel function. And to lose that is devastating to an individual. And rather than risk having an episode of incontinence, may make a decision to try and get to the toilet as quickly as they can. And if there is a further risk to a further deficiency in the mobility at that time, a fall may occur.
How frequently are falls and toileting connected?
Very, very frequently.
Yeah. And is it best, I noticed that one of the things that you've raised already is that having that buzzer or having a kind of plan around getting patients at risk to the toilet, how important is that when it comes to falls?
It's absolutely critical. We ideally should be rounding out our patients near constantly and seeing them at least a few times an hour, laying eyes over them and checking if they're okay, if they need anything. That's not always practically possible due to workload constraints, and particularly if in the event of a significant escalation in care requirements.
Yeah.
So an episode of agitation, aggression from a patient, family member, or even a staff member, or a medical emergency.
Yeah.
These can very quickly take up a large amount of nursing resources.
Yeah. Okay. So what else? So you've kind of mentioned, cognitive deficits. You've mentioned the toilet. Why else do patients fall?
So a degree of physical frailty, disability in particular. Age is a significant contributor. If a patient is spending a considerable amount of time on bed rest, there is significant and fairly rapid degradation in muscular function and a patient's ability to independently mobilize. So it's in the order of 2 to 3% of muscular strength and capability is lost over the course of one day of bed rest.
2 to 3%. I lost every day. I didn't know that. I'm sure you did, Jesse, but I didn't.
So there was a recent study performed in the Royal, which found that these very significant percentages of impairment take place very rapidly.
Yeah, and that goes back to the Eat, Walk and Engage program, isn't it, about how critical it is even to get people sitting up, etc.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
We'd encourage people to go back to that original episode.
Bed rest lying down also results in a fluid shift in the body, where if it's left unchecked for too long, a patient sitting up can have a very sudden drop in their blood pressure, which can result in dizziness. It can result in syncope.
Yeah, well.
You've mentioned, I guess, deconditioning and physical impairment and cognitive impairment. What are the impacts of sort of perceptual impairments?
Yes, so in particular, visual impairments. Primarily, I work with a patient cohort over the age of 65, and visual impairment is a very significant issue. There's also concerns of neurological and sensory concerns. So a very substantial portion of patients admitted to the Royal have diabetes in some form. I think it's in the order of 30% of our patients have some form of diabetes now, and that can result in sensory deficits. A patient may take a step and not feel their foot hitting the floor correctly, and that can result in either under or overcorrection of a muscular action, which can then result in a fall. Another area is medications. So particularly opioid analgesics can have an impact on perception, balance, and a patient's general ability to mobilize. The same thing with benzodiazepine medications. And if a patient is on an antihypertensive regularly and it has been administered when the patient was already hypotensive that day, then that can also result in a significantly increased risk of a fall.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a really comprehensive list, and there are a few things that I hadn't thought of that I think are really important. So your number 2 is, how do you screen for the risk of falls with our patients?
Yeah, so the default answer for this question would often be the risk assessment, but it's very important to recognize that a risk assessment, it can often end up just being a tick and flick list that you do because your team leader has told you to do it. It never replaces clinical judgment, and that point needs to be significantly emphasized. So taking a comprehensive history for your patient is essential in all forms of nursing care, especially in this case for falls risk. So the patient's previous level of function is very important to ascertain. Do they walk using a walker, a walking stick? Are they chair-bound but still able to pivot transfer onto a wheelchair? If we can ascertain from the patient directly how they would normally be getting around.
Yeah.
And this also saves us the time of having to track down someone from the physiotherapy team to assess a patient. And any time that we're able to be mobilizing a patient to the best of their current ability, it's time spent not on bed rest.
Yeah.
So assessing for injury, pain, and disability.
Yep.
If a patient is having significant pain in one of their legs, they're probably going to be very ginger about actually stepping on that limb, which can easily cause them to limp and stumble, can also cause them to refuse to mobilize at all. So maintaining that pain control is essential in this instance. So identifying concerns relating to incontinence. Does this patient have urgency incontinence? If so, you really need to be able to very rapidly attend to them if they need to be toileted.
Can I ask a question? Given that incontinence is such a big issue, is a commode a safer option, or is it just as tricky to get a person onto a commode quickly beside the bed as it is to get them to the toilet, and because of privacy issues, etc.?
It is very situational, and it can be very difficult to maintain patient privacy if not actually taking them all the way into the toilet and closing the door before having them remove whatever articles of clothing are necessary. So bringing a commode to the bedside and closing the curtains, it just removes the visual aspect.
Yeah.
There are still sounds involved in the process.
I mean, I wouldn't want to use a commode. I get that, but I just wondered, from a falls risk, is it something you recommend, or just from dignity and integrity, it's much better to get them to the bathroom?
It's generally much better to try and mobilize the patient all the way to the bathroom.
Yeah.
If that's not possible, then mobilizing them using whatever aids they have as far as practically possible. So the Serosteti, for example, can be used to bring the patient up, keeping them fully clothed until you've gotten into the bathroom, at which point you can close the door, then have them stand again, then remove clothing.
Okay.
It's a very individualized assessment, I guess, is balancing dignity. Some patients will actually say, can you get me the commode? And then you can use that as a kind of a hybrid to overcome the urgency.
Yeah.
If they really can't hold, literally they can just get out of bed onto that.
Yeah.
And then you can, I guess, cover them up with a blanket on the way and use that as a, I guess, pseudo wheelchair to get them to the toilet and toilet over the toilet in that privacy as well.
Oh,
so
okay,
it serves different purposes. It can be a great mechanism. It's a bit higher to get on and off than a toilet as well. So there's no one size fits all. But I guess in terms of that risk assessment, going back to the ethos of this this question, is the urgency incontinence is a high independent risk for a fall.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's worth noting that if we just went by the patient demographics in our hospital and the patients who are coming in, if we correctly completed the standard stratified risk assessment tool for every patient, we would have approximately 90% of our patients coming up as at high risk of falling.
Yeah, right.
Using the tool in isolation is a waste of a sheet of paper.
Yeah, okay. I see what you're saying.
but we have to use it.
It's important that we do. But it's also more important to understand why we do.
Yeah. And I guess if you've got 90% of people coming back as high risk for falls, you can get kind of complacent that, oh, well, it's almost inevitable they're going to fall. Whereas if you do a clinical risk and you're talking to their family and you're talking to them, then you're much more likely to be able to create a safety plan that actually is likely to work for that person.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think although the falls risk assessment tools compile to give a score, not all items are equal when we look at this stuff. So looking at things like those massive red flags of urgency incontinence combined with mobility deficit, that's going to be pretty much almost a guaranteed fall, isn't it, if you don't have a strategy in place? So it does compile up differently. There's an interesting one from the Ottawa falls risk assessment tool that they found for predicting falls, repeat falls on discharge from the emergency department. And the highest individual predictor was the patient's inability to cut their own toenails. It kind of ended up performing very, very well as a high risk prediction of repeat attendance with a fall in the future.
Yeah. That whole thing of feet, which we have explored before in this podcast.
I hate feet.
So do I.
In theory, my ward is an endocrine ward, and so diabetic patients are our bread and butter. So, yeah.
What else has come with the territory?
Absolutely.
Yeah, right. So your number 3 is, what is the impact of falls on our patients?
So the clearest and most obvious impact of a fall is the physical impact, which can result in head injuries, which can then have much, much more severe consequences down the line. So brain hemorrhages, for example, very significant. And these require a significant amount of hospital resources in order to rule out. So use of the CT scanner. It's a consumption of resources that, if it's not entirely necessary, it'd be great if we didn't have to do it.
And also terrible for the patients.
Oh, absolutely. It's going into the donut.
Yeah.
And these are often patients who are either cognitively impaired or in a state of delirium. That can be a pretty terrifying experience.
Yeah.
Add in the fact that fractures are a possibility to whichever part of the body the patient happened to land on. The acronym that I most enjoy, which I learnt from some time spent in the emergency department at the Queensland Children's Hospital, is FOOSH. Fall on outstretched hand. It can also be a significant blow to a patient's confidence. If they've fallen, they're likely to be very wary about falling again. And that can lead to an inward and mental block towards further mobilizing.
Yeah.
And that can be a significant impact on a patient's recovery. They may require additional time in hospital in order to undergo physiotherapy treatment to rebuild strength enough to be able to meet their expected level of function at home. And it could also require inpatient rehab.
Yeah.
I always think of the kind of one unifying factor that's if we're going to say what is the impact of falls, it's time and quality, but time. So it adds to the patient's time in hospital. It takes functional and quality time away from the patient. It takes significant time and resource from the system, from the staff, and from other patients as well, because of then you've got an extra unplanned use of a CT scanner or X-ray, or so it's a stacking effect, I think, is that, and that time does not actually shorten their initial illness or reason that they had coming in. That's one of the things that we've found with it's true to MET calls as well. I think we talked about that in our MET episode, is that stuff just stacks on top of what was already going to be the initial admission, and then will generally leave a patient who's already frail at a higher degree of frailty on discharge.
Yeah, absolutely. And statistically, about 30% of our patients on discharge have a greater level of weakness, frailty, inability to mobilize, and they have a level of functional decline greater than when they came into hospital. and that increases the risk of further presentations into hospital for various reasons. And yeah, it's a pretty big cause of morbidity.
Yeah. How often does a fall in hospital then lead to someone no longer being able to live independently?
I don't know the statistics off the top of my head, but it is quite significant. If the trends in inpatient falls are tracked forward to 2051, for example, there's an expectation that we would require an additional 500 inpatient beds at a state level just to manage acute falls.
Wow.
And that would then lead to an expectation of requiring about another 850 residential aged care places because of a lack of ability of those patients to regain their independence.
Yeah. I'm rapidly trying to do the math in my head going, is that my demographic in 2051? Yeah, that's, but it's terrifying. It's that whole, use it or lose it, isn't it? Kind of mentality that whatever age you are as a listener, you need to be keeping some element of physical strength, because as you age, you need to be mobile, not just for your physical strength, but for your mental health as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yes, mathematically, you're correct.
Shut up.
I'm going to be 67 in 2051, which puts you a little bit
younger.
Bit more.
So your number 4 is how do we actually prevent falls? You've kind of led into this a little bit, but what are some practical strategies that bedside nurses can implement to prevent falls?
The most practical and probably the most far-reaching strategy that nurses can institute to prevent falls is to exercise clinical judgment.
Yep.
The majority of our patients can mobilize, and it's fairly easy to identify in the majority of these patients what level of mobility we can reasonably expect. It's important that we facilitate mobility wherever possible, providing necessary mobility aids, ensuring that they are present for the patient to use. Ideally, ensuring that in the event of a local shortage of, say, wheelie walkers, that they are ideally not being borrowed, and if they are being borrowed, chasing them down to ensure that they are returned to where they are supposed to be. A patient who needs a walker to move and doesn't have it, it's going to cause them some distress there. Ensure adequate pain management. If we are keeping pain under control, a patient is going to have a lot more willingness to mobilize in a way that is safe for them. And it's highly important that we prevent inpatient functional decline as much as possible. As we said earlier, bed rest causes a very rapid degradation in muscular strength, and ensuring that we have the patients moving helps to prevent that. It's, I believe, 900 steps is the daily requirement for an individual to prevent functional decline in their legs.
I'm trying to work that out. 900 steps, that's probably only about a K a day, is that right? 10,000 steps is about 7 kilometres.
And it's probably a lot less with an elderly person who's got a shorter gait as well. So a few laps of the ward will achieve 900 steps when you're only taking 30 to 50 centimetre steps.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. And to facilitate that, keep the environment as clutter-free as you practically can. So the corridors outside of the patient bays and patient rooms, they're a good place to be mobilizing and to walk. And we have patients who will go for quite substantial walks, if nothing else, to stave off the boredom and to prevent becoming stir crazy staring at the ceiling.
Yeah.
But obstacles are going to prevent the patient being able to adequately mobilize. So OBS machines, beds, other equipment in the hallways, for example. The cleaning trolleys and the food trolleys are unavoidable presences, but we can ensure that they are stored in such a way that they are not going to provide too much of an obstacle for the patient.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about nighttime? I always have to pee in the middle of the night. As you get older, is it a bigger issue when it's darker? And, what sort of strategies, are there night lights? Should people have torches?
the biggest and most important one is that the patient is able to access their buzzer.
Their buzzer.
The buzzer has a light switch on it,
Okay.
which if that's not working, it's critical that we make sure that it is working. Because if the patient were to suddenly have chest pain in the middle of the night,
Yeah.
we need to be able to act on that immediately. And if the buzzer isn't working or the buzzer isn't in reach, then that can lead to fairly catastrophic consequences for that patient.
So sorry for my ignorance, but in terms of if you're trying to place a buzzer somewhere where an elderly person or person who also might have mobility or visual problems, is there an ideal place? Like you tuck it in beside their upper body?
The best way to figure this out is to speak with the patient,
Yeah.
ask for their preference.
Yeah. Okay.
I find that the majority of my patients would prefer it if the beds on my ward primarily have effectively a grab surface on the upper part of the bed rail.
Yeah.
You will typically feed the buzzer through,
Yep.
wrap it around once, and then there's a little clip on the cable, and I'll clip it on so that the buzzer can't severely shift away from that point, and the patient can just access the button. Yeah.
Yeah.
But we also have more specialized tools that can be accessed through occupational therapy services for patients who have deficiencies in their ability to manipulate a buzzer.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, there's so many different directions we could go down on the discussion with it. Hey, but one of the things, just to come back to your question about nights as well, is a lot of people who are acutely unwell in hospital, particularly on a general medical ward, will have nighttime medications. If you're going in and waking someone up to do their med check to give them an antibiotic, who is someone who has incontinence issues, in the middle of the night say, hey, while I'm here,
Yeah.
is it a good time? Do you feel like you need to go to the toilet? So rather than kind of going in, do that, and then go on to your next job, and then the buzzer goes and you're halfway through doing an antibiotic somewhere else,
Yeah.
actually going cluster night cares as much as possible. Use those opportunities because you don't want to wake the patient.
No.
And it also improves from that aspect is it's a 1 point of waking if you can. And it might have a 25% yield, but that's significant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
That's 25% of patients who have had their continence maintained.
Yeah, that's right. Which is
Yeah,
important.
clustering cares is extremely helpful.
Yeah, because it can kind of get lost. There's definitely a push towards proactive toileting, but if you disjoint that from other expected cares, it just adds to your workload and also makes more likelihood of you being bumped off something and missing something.
Yeah, proactively toileting is extremely effective when you have the workforce present to facilitate that. Yeah. And another point to make is that restrictive practices have absolutely no evidence of preventing inpatient falls, nor do devices such as bed alarms or grippy socks.
Okay.
There is no hard evidence of those having any impact on preventing patient falls. They can cause us to become complacent.
In fact, patients trying to climb out over a bed rail, and that's what we mean by restrictive practices, is having the bed rails up can increases the likelihood of injury from the falls, because not all falls are equal, and we kind of didn't touch on that. Is there's falls in terms of what I'd call administrative falls, where they create a burden but there's no injury from them.
Yeah.
And they're counted statistically the same. The ones that we're really, really seriously trying to prevent falls with injury.
Yeah.
And having bed rails up actually, quite logically when you think through it, it doesn't increase the risk of someone trying to get out of bed. And if they do, they usually get tripped or stuck or over
they're climbing over high height.
And
then try and climb out the end of the bed, which isn't designed for it.
Yeah, and they're falling now from higher up than they would be otherwise.
Yeah.
And without their feet under them. They're falling
I'd
largely
imagine,
hip fracture or head and neck injuries with those sorts of parallel falls.
Yeah. So what you're saying is restrictive practices can actually increase the nature of the floor, the amount of impact and injury that will be sustained. So there's no evidence for it, so don't
Absolutely.
do it.
And that goes doubly, triply for any form of chemical restraint of a patient.
Yeah.
Where the long-acting effects of a sedative medication can result in unusual, unexpected behaviors, and also a reduction in a patient's sense of balance and their judgment.
Yeah, right.
I think it's very similar to delirium, and it's a mnemonic that I just love using, so I'm going to force it in here.
5 Ps.
But I feel the 5 Ps, yeah.
Definitely relevant here.
Yeah. So pee, poo, pain, pus, poisons. So we're looking pee in terms of continence and toileting, poo in terms of either are they fecally incontinent, do they have diarrhea, or are they becoming constipated? So regular bowel, because constipation contributes to delirium and falls. Pain, you've already hit on that, mobilising. This is largely a summary. Pus, is there signs of infection? And we should always be considering that. As the behaviour changed slightly? Is there, we should always think infection first before thinking cognitive decline, and poisons, review of medications and trying to rationalise those medications.
Perfect. Oh, another P word. Okay, so your number 5 is the role of stakeholders or family, other disciplines, I guess, in preventing falls.
Yeah, absolutely. So a patient's falls risk and a patient's mobility, ultimately it's everybody's responsibility. All clinicians working with that patient's case have a part to play, and all of that patient's family and community supports have a role to play. So it's easy to think that if the patient is having pain concerns, consult with their medical team. If it's a pain issue that is not being adequately managed, we have pain specialists available for that. The patient's capacity to mobilize is assessed by physiotherapists, and nursing staff must, as a part of their regular duties, maintain supervision of that to ensure that the patient is mobilizing to their capacity. Occupational therapy can play a part for any specific functional issues that patient may have. So ensuring that correct ergonomics for that patient are maintained. Even nutrition, dietetics play a role, because nutrition is critical for our recovery. You can't build muscle if you don't have adequate energy and protein intakes.
I know that 9B South, because I go up there regularly, you seem to have a corner that's got colourful things, etc. What are some of the activities that you're doing as part of Eat, Walk and Engage to encourage mobility and decrease the chance of falls?
Absolutely. We are primary consumers of the services of the Eat, Walk, Engage program, where we ensure that we have additional support of a morning from a non-directly clinical staff member who will assist us in ensuring that our patients are sitting out of bed wherever possible to have their meals. Sitting out of bed leads to better food intake, better fluid intake by our patients. When lying down in bed, you're going to have trouble opening packets. It can be easy to spill things on yourself. We also engage in cognitive activities with our patients, ensuring that we're keeping the patients engaged as far as we can, because a lack of mental engagement can very quickly result in a delirium, which very rapidly increases all risks to that patient.
So if I've got an elderly patient who's come in, and I know that their son and daughter-in-law come every afternoon at 5:00, how do I engage them to encourage, movement, mobility, eating, etc., to try and prevent falls?
My experience is that most of my patients absolutely love a change of scenery. If a patient is able to mobilize with a minimal level of assistance, encourage the patient's family members or their visitors to go for a walk with them. Go out into the corridor.
Yeah, and you're not suggesting taking someone who's 90 down for a huge walk around the block. You're just saying take them for a walk down the corridor, take them to look through a different window, take them to the little coffee hub, one floor over, just as a change of scenery.
Absolutely. It's remarkably effective in ensuring that the patient can mobilize, but also wants to mobilize.
Yeah.
It's like yard time in prison.
We do have a lot of patients that do in some of their lower moments liken hospital
Or to
time to being prison. Yes.
Yeah, we laugh at that. That it would be terrible, wouldn't it, to be trapped? Yeah.
Yeah, and being confined by walls, but also then confined by your own body.
Yes.
It's distressing.
Yeah. Okay, so I found that really interesting. Thanks, Jacob. And I'm now going to attempt to summarize that. So our number one was, why do patients fall? And essentially, outside of the hospital, I heard that tripping on carpets, rugs, etc., is the number one reason. But in hospital, there's a whole multi components of why. So some of it is environmental, furniture, equipment, trip hazards. Some of it's frailty, disability, sensory deficits for people who have diabetes, they can't feel. It can be because they've got altered consciousness from medications. Their perception and balance can be off, that it's a loss of strength. If there's any visual problems, make sure that they've got their glasses on. And the big one I also heard was people who have problems with continence and trying to get to the toilet is a major trip hazard. Your number two is, how do we screen for falls? And you said, obviously there is a risk assessment, but for many elderly patients who come into our hospital, this ends up being a tick and flick, and it doesn't really give us the details that is going to help us make our patients safe. And so you really stress the importance of really good clinical judgment. So take a comprehensive history, understand previous function, always be doing an assessment, because injury, pain, disability, loss of perception can all increase our chance of having a fall. And again, understand what's this person's history with continence or incontinence and how urgent it is for that person. Your number three is, what is the impact of falls? And you said, there's physical impact. If people fall, the severe end of that is a head injury, fractures, any sort of bodily injury. But you also talked that people then can have this huge impact of confidence. And if a person has a fall, then they're much less likely to independently mobilise, which will, of course, reduce their strength and increase their chance of actually having another fall. But it also really decreases their recovery, increases our need for hospital resources. And Jessie referred to it as a stacking effect, mainly around time. So time stuck in hospital, time of resources, etc. Your number four was, how do we prevent falls? And you said, anytime we can, with good clinical judgment, get these people mobile, help them keep their strength, reduce the chance of delirium, encourage that mobility wherever possible, and do that by keeping their pain under control and making sure that their environment is as safe as possible. Be very wary and mindful of medications or changes to medications. If they are someone who have urgent incontinence, be aware of that. Jessie was saying, at night time, if you have to give meds, make sure you cluster those cares and ask the person, would this be a great time to go to the toilet? Be really mindful to have access, that patient has access to their buzzer. And you made a lovely last point that there is absolutely zero evidence for restricting people from movement, and that actually putting bed rails up, grippy socks, all of those things don't really help. Your number five is the role of stakeholders in preventing falls. And I guess what I took from this is that falls are everybody's responsibility, from the cleaner to the family who are visiting to, everybody should be thinking, does that patient look like they're getting out of bed without assistance, and perhaps they'd use it? And that any family member who's visiting, we really encourage you, wherever safe, please get your loved one up and moving. That's a great and interesting podcast. Jacob, thank you for being so brave as a new graduate, for coming and joining us today on 5 Things.
Thank you for having me.
The Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital 5 Things Nursing Podcast acknowledges the Turrbal and Yagara as the First Nations owners of the lands we now tread. We pay respect to their elders, laws, customs and creation spirits. We recognise that these lands have always been places of healing, teaching and learning. We also wish to acknowledge the First Nations people of the lands of our global community and encourage our listeners to seek out, listen and learn from the knowledge held in your shared space. As well as all major podcast outlets, you can find us at 5thingsnursing.podbean.com. Please also subscribe and give us a rating on your listening platform of choice. This helps others find the podcast. And finally, if you'd like to connect with Liz or myself on Twitter, we can be found at LizCrow2. And for me, it's inject_orange. We would absolutely love to hear your thoughts, ideas, or feedback. Thanks for listening to 5 Things